Hello everyone, today we talk about strategy and diplomatic relations in 6th century Europe. So this is gonna be essentially a overlook about the political situation of chiefly Western Europe and the Mediterranean during the first half of the 6th century. And we will basically focus on the role that the Ostrogothic Kingdom of Italy had in the balance between the Mediterranean and continental Europe. This is very important because Ostrogothic Italy, together with Visigothic Spain, basically formed up an axis that was aimed to counter the Byzantines and the Franks from one side and the other. Naturally, this wasn't. We're not talking about the so-called Greek Gothic War today. That comes later. So let's say today we stop essentially to the end of Theodoric the Great's reign. So we won't be looking at how this system eventually collapsed. I mean, of course, we will comment on that too, but we will look into relative detail just up, let's say, to the very end of Theodoric's reign. And I think this is a quite overlooked topic because for most people out there, I guess, that when there is this sort of decadentistic perspective for which when the western half of the Roman Empire fell, oh yeah, that happened, that threw everything into chaos, into the dark ages. Oh, what a terrible thing. As a matter of fact, late antique culture survived in various parts of the formerly western half of the Roman Empire for a very long time. You can argue that in the case of Italy, it was until essentially the Greek Gothic War and the Longobard invasion. In other areas, it went even longer. You can argue that, I don't know, in Visigothic Spain that began with the watershed was the Arabs. France was a bit mitigated in here by the fact that Gaul was not really didn't go under a great deal of destruction during this period. So late antique culture kind of died out very progressively. And telling the truth, especially in the north of Gaul rather than in the south. But generally speaking, you know that this is a moment into which, essentially before the Justinian's plague, the late antique culture and also international political gaming, in many ways, remained in the same fashion it had been in the previous centuries. If you look at these Romano-Germanic kingdoms, you realize they were pretty big in size, first of all, which is something that naturally jars with what you think of, especially the rest of the Middle Ages, where everything was way more fragmented. So you had basically this big sections, big fractions of the continent were still able, at least nominally, but sometimes not really, depends on which kingdom we're talking about, were able to encompass very wide areas. Just take a look at this map. I mean, all we see here is chiefly these Gothic Commonwealth, we could say. Obviously it wasn't conceived in that way. It was still sort of personal way of conceiving power in the Germanic world, etc. But look at Ostrogothic Italy, for instance, and look at how many other areas it encompasses. Look at even at the Visigothic Kingdom, Spain. It's pretty big, and also the Frankish Kingdom at this point that is expanding in this very wide area of Western Europe. Then there is also the Byzantine Empire, of course, but that's no surprise in many ways, but it's still important also to remember how powerful it was. Here we've got the Vandal Kingdom as well. It was a sort of more of a it was smaller because in Africa, just like with the Romans, urbanization and the sedentary society didn't go too much inland. but it was still a hell of a power, especially a maritime power that, however, the Ostrogoths at this time had managed to curb. In fact, Theodoric the Great ransomed Sicily from the Vandals, and that was quite important because he had to rule over Italy, and Italy was fed with the Sicilian grain. So that was, for instance, a very important strategical point, although also Africa from this point of view was very important. But this is not, I don't wanna go into a too long digression in here. What I want to really concentrate is the relations that were created among these powers that were actually pretty intense. It was a moment of relative peace, as there were minor clashes, like there were clashes in the first place, especially between the Franks and the Goths for the control of southern Gaul, etc. But it wasn't a moment of great reorganization of the territorial dominions at this point. It was essentially a balance. And the major change in here would have been only in later times, in the 30s of the 6th century, when the Byzantines launched this major reconquest of the Western Mediterranean. So they captured Africa, Italy, and parts of southern Gaul and southern Spain. But southern Gaul, it's often not said, but basically this is what I would like to leave you today with, the idea that sometimes you don't really have even to physically conquer one place. I mean, to send an army in there to exercise a certain power directly. So we have at least no evidence. By the way, this is also a problem. We have only some evidence that is limited about the Byzantines invading southern Gaul during their reconquest. But we know that certain cities of the Rhone Delta, for instance, that were so open to the Mediterranean, pretty urbanized, and still had a pretty functional Roman society. Even though there was no Roman Empire in there anymore, they still minted imperial coins. So what's really the point? I mean, the Franks were a bit too far for controlling that directly. There was no other major power controlling that area, de facto at least, because these were also autonomous. And this is, we get the first, prodromes of the autonomization that would have followed into the later centuries. But hey, these were Romans. They still had a Roman administration and still made everything functioning. Yeah, it was local aristocracies, it was local elites that managed everything, but it's still meaningful that they recognize themselves as part of the Roman Empire. Even the reconquest of southern Spain, just to make a meaningful example relatively to our historical evidence, we don't know when it actually happened. I mean, about Africa and Italy, we know that, because those were campaigns that were very well documented. We don't know if southern Spain was conquered before or after the reconquest of Italy, for instance, and we will very likely never know. So this is kind of interesting, and the major, however, as I was saying before, there was also a big deal of competition between these powers, as you realize, and the major problem at this point, as we will see, was kind of swinging between the really the two main I can say influences, but rather political models, either the Germanic ones or the Roman ones. And at this time, and we talk about Romano-Germanic Europe at this point, or Latin-Germanic Europe, because this is basically what it was about. It was not a moment in which the Roman Empire was vanished at all. The Roman Empire in this first half of the 6th century was pretty much alive and pretty much stable as well. If it hadn't been so, Justinian could have never launched the reconquest of the West. It was a pretty stable situation. The major plague that wiped out huge fractions of the Eurasian populations at this point was not there. Naturally, in the previous centuries, the Mediterranean and Europe had undergone sensible, say, contraction, or rather transformation, because you can debate even how this actually was, but it had objectively shrunk. I mean, if you see especially the manpower, you realize that this was a world that had slowly shrank and declined, if you really want to use this term, but it was still pretty much alive. There were many resources, and the proof of this in Western Europe is, among the other things, the ability of kingdoms like the one of the Franks and the Ostrogoths to be so active from a military point of view, from a diplomatical point of view, and to be able to control huge parts of Europe at this time and expanding in them and expanding their influence in there. So the most active of these powers, at least from a strictly military point of view, that is essentially invading other areas, was definitely the Frankish Kingdom. I've been talking extensively about the Frankish Kingdom recently. Today it could be useful because I made recently a video about Clovis, and today we're starting to talk essentially about the same period. So if you want to check it out, the title is The Franks and Clovis from Germany to Empire. That kind of tells us how, from the Frankish perspective, how this had begun, really. And how the Franks rose to be this major regional power in Western Europe. We haven't been talking a big deal of the Ostrogoths. Yes, I made a video about the Ostrogoths that you should be find into the medieval Italy playlist, but that was mostly aimed at looking at the internal functioning, I mean, the relation between the Romans and Goths within the same kingdom of Italy. It can be useful, but I haven't still gone thoroughly into I still haven't covered the history of the Ostrogothic kingdom thoroughly. Today we will try to add a bit more to that, so if you're interested in that specifically, this video can fit for you. So Clovis, just to make the long story short, without repeating myself, had managed to reunite the Franks, to wipe out most of the other Frankish aristocracies, and establishing a sort of dynastic power all over the people. By the way, reversing what natural trend, let's say tradition of the people of the Franks was, because Frank means free, and the Germans didn't like at all to have a dynasty that ruled them. Clovis, in this sense, changed history radically. And in addition to this, he manages to channel all the Frankish power to subjugate other populations that were surrounding. They did so with the Alamanni, with the Burgundians, with the Visigoths. It was happening just right now, between the end of the 5th and the beginning of the 6th century. So this was the major time of trouble for the external powers that were looking at the Franks and saying, wow, these guys are really rocketing, and we have to stem them in some fashion. So basically the military dynamism of Clovis found the major obstacle into this net of friendships and parental relations that the Theodoric's diplomacy from Ravenna, the Italian capital, managed to build, especially with in the relations with those Germanic peoples that were still not really framed in a sedentary organization. This is very important because it goes back to what I was saying before. What was the moment? In this moment, really the model of political model was searched by these peoples. In here, still, we're still in the full migration era by certain standards. I mean, the migration era, at least, is not over. There are these major Germanic population who have sedentarized, but they have done it from a relatively short time. So they still are not fully integrated with the Roman populations. This would bring also to certain degree of instability, especially in certain kingdoms, especially those ruled by the Goths. So the Goths at this time actually have a very strong military power, especially the Ostrogoths. The Vandals were, the Visigoths were kind of so-so. They were trying to expand in Spain, also successfully by some extent, but the main problem with the Goths is that they didn't immediately push for the direct integration with the Romans. So by certain standards, and this is pretty evident in Italy, is that there was actually a great cooperation between the Goths and the Romans. Especially Ostrogothic Italy was the most brilliant example of this. I mean, Ostrogothic Italy at this time was still Roman. There was a Senate, there was a Roman administration, the Roman latifundia were standing. The military was in the hands of the Goths, but it still benefited of the Roman administration from this point of view. The Goths controlled the armories, the great armor production of weapons and stuff. So Italy was well served infrastructurally. It had lots of cities, still functioning, fully functioning Roman cities, ports, access to the Mediterranean, controlled. There were also environmental factors, geographical, the local geography that kind of favored the Ostrogothic domination, but in part, and by the way, this is the most important thing, Theodoric, in his Germanic council in Ravenna, actually was joined also by Roman representatives. So Germans and Romans cooperated. But the main problem is that being there still a senatorial aristocracy alive that looked still favorably to the Byzantine Empire, as, let's try to get into that. For now, let's cooperate for the Goths. First of all, because the Goths have been sent into Italy by the same Romans, so they're governing on the imperials, on the emperor's behalf, because this is how the Goths eventually were. This is complicated. I should tell you a bit more about this as a general information, but it's important to bear in mind that however, it doesn't matter how well this thing worked, especially under Theodoric the Great, but there was still this inherent problem that the Roman aristocracies that were scattered into the Apennine Peninsula were, scattered. They were there structurally, systemically speaking. They were still looking favorably at Constantinople as a viable ruler that was preferred to the Goths. So this, especially in later times, would have brought would bring to a substantial weakness of the system. And the moment in which this was fully surpassed was only with the Longobards, because the Longobards arrived into Italy when the senatorial elite had been wiped out by the Greek-Gothic War. And therefore they didn't have these problems of dealing with local senatorial aristocracy. Naturally, also the Longobards cooperated with the local Romans, but it was more a cultural thing. They really didn't inherit a Roman system in there. They kind of created their own from scratch, because that's a very few of what was the Roman administration had remained at that point. Now, why I might saying this, because sometimes the splendor of Theodoric's Italy is kind of overshadows eventually the problems that happened later. First of all, there is also the opposite problem, because there are lots of people out there who think that these Goths were just barbarians, and it was a shame that, I don't know, that Italy was ruled by the Goths, but these are just insane prejudices, and they don't have anything to do with factual history. But I think it's pretty evident how eventually this missed opportunity of, Italy couldn't have a much different future at that point. Surely during the Greek-Gothic War, things could have been handled better. I mean, if Belisarius' campaign had brought to security what had, if Italy had been secured after Belisarius' campaign, definitely Italy would have avoided all the devastations that occurred later with under the sudden the following revolt. How do you say that in English? Let's see that. I hate what I don't know the words. Freaking. The comeback. Well, there is not a proper word in English for expressing what I wanted to say, but everybody knows with Totila, etc., what the Goths kind of rose with arms again against the Romans, and that could have been avoided, and it was actually the thing that destroyed Italy properly. But at that point, it was really actually for the Goths trying to engage the Italic populations into a great political and social change, that is getting rid of this extremely senatorial aristocracy. There were very few people that ruled a huge amount of land and controlled masses and masses of people. So Totila's action was actually also about freeing slaves, freeing colons, freeing people who in this sense were invited to join into the Germanic freemen's model. I don't know why I'm talking about this. This is a video aimed at talking about international relations. But it's important to stress also how this balance was the strategical balance we're going to discuss now was relatively unstable, or at least it had certain premises that were necessarily to bring to pretty solid consequences in a way or in another. So how did this how did the Goths really were able to keep this thing in an orderly fashion? I mean, how did Theodoric at the beginning manage to counter the Franks so we were talking about the diplomatic relations, and this happened. A big deal of this was done through matrimonial bonds. Theodoric's family had lots of women that were sent as spouses to some of the major political figures of the Romano-Germanic world. And we can make a list, actually, of this. Theodegotha, for instance, was... first of all, Theodoric was married only once. And he also... he had a concubine in Maesia, so in this Illyrian area, over which, by the way, the Ostrogothic Kingdom also still had it had influences before actually coming to the Ostrogoths were in Maesia, originally speaking, in the Balkans, before arriving to Italy, and it was an area that eventually, when the Goths left, was more directly under the Byzantine control, but still had partially a tie with Theodoric, as it was still bordering the Ostrogothic Kingdom's possession. You see it here actually from the map. So when Theodoric was in there, he had these two daughters. The first one was Theodogotha, and she was married to Alaric II of the Visigoths, and so this had ensured an alliance, the first alliance with the Goths of Spain. The Goths cared about their own, let's say, of being akin. And they recognized the fact that they had a sort of common origin, even if the Goths had a pretty tormented ethnical history to tell it all. And also in here we should have to talk only 2 hours about only how the two groups were formed and splitted under different history, but however they still recognize themselves as Goths, and they had all a particular pride attached to it that was mostly not even a strictly ethnical thing that naturally existed, but it was also really a political model that they had set, because the Goths were the most some of the most Romanized Germanic peoples at this time. I mean, there were Germanic peoples like the Franks that had, especially the Franks, telling the truth, had stuck mostly to the Roman model. Clovis was pretty, the Franks had been traditionally allied to the Romans. Clovis had converted directly from paganism to Catholicism without passing through Arianism. And he had been very tolerant with the Roman elites in Gaul, because he understood he needed them in order to rule over the area. The Goths were a bit different from this, and naturally what Clovis did was a bit of an exception, and that's the reason why actually the Franks were in this sense not more Romanized, but more pro-Roman than the Goths. However, the truly mostly Romanized from a civil point of view had been the Goths. After Adrianople, the Visigoths were essentially the first Germanic people to enter physically into the Roman Empire, and to deal with it, to fight for the Romans, to live within the imperial boundaries. So they had been those who had Romanized the most, in large part. The Ostrogoths were, and eventually, as we know, they settled into Spain, and many of you will say, oh well, but the Vandals, the Visigoths also sacked Rome. Yes, but that you don't have to take that in positive terms, as if those were the Germans who punished the Romans. No, it wasn't like that. They just wanted to be paid for their military service to Rome. The Goths spilled a freaking amount of blood for the Romans on the various frontiers of the empire. They just wanted to be paid. Rome was unguarded. The sack of Rome was pretty much controlled. They just wanted money. When they did that, eventually they left Italy. They went to Spain, created a kingdom there. Of course, these Goths weren't feeling themselves as Romans or subjects of the Romans. The Germans never had a kind of they always felt to be superior to the Romans, and to deal with them, to negotiate with them at a paritary level. But still, they had Romanized unavoidably. The Roman army was the most powerful Romanizing tool that existed at the time, and the Goths had been schooled in that fashion. The Ostrogoths were a bit different, as they actually had stuck into the Barbaricum. They had not entered into the Roman Empire up to a certain point, and they had actually stuck because they were, by the way, at the beginning they were living in the Ukraine, so they were also pretty far from say the core, at least, of the Roman Empire, and they had stuck with the Huns. So if you see, for instance, the Battle of the Caudalian Plains, the battle of 451 between the Romans and the Huns, you realize that the Visigoths were from the side were fighting alongside the Romans, while the Ostrogoths were fighting alongside the Huns. So actually there had been major differences between these two peoples, also because living into the sedentary Mediterranean and living into the semi-nomadic Barbaricum was a wholly different experience, and I can't stress this enough. Seemingly, in fact, the Ostrogoths had a much better cavalry than the Visigoths, even though also those were praised for cavalry eventually. Then eventually were absorbed. They were settled into Maesia by the Romans and sent to Italy to recover the peninsula for the Romans. Zeno had sent Theodoric into Italy. Theodoric had defeated Odoacer. That had been Odoacer had not really brought also in here it's difficult. I would like to stress another thing is very important, is that even when we say in the 476 AD conventionally the Western Roman Empire kind of finished, which is also relatively false, because up to 486 there was still Syagrius, up to 490 I don't remember whether 91 or 93 was still Nepos. So there were that was actually the end of the western half of the Roman Empire. By the way, the empire was only one, even when it was split in two. It was just an administrative division. So Theodoric had been sent to Odoacer, who had not really finished the Roman Empire. It just had said, okay, now I change a bit the rule of the game. This is not empire anymore, but I appoint myself as king of the German say bands that are in here as the local army, and in this way I give back the imperial insignia to Constantinople, so I have my power recognized in turn, and at the same time I get rid of all these problems with the succession of the emperors and all. So it was actually a fair deal, if not for the fact that the Byzantines wanted to get rid of the Ostrogoths that were settled in Maesia and sent them into the west. This is what Constantinople did, pretty cleverly, by the way, because all these populations were definitely pretty comforting. I mean, they weren't surely a nice let's say a comforting presence along the border, and they sent them into Italy by saying, okay, now you go to Italy, you crush Odoacer, but remember that you are under the empire. So really, before Justinian's pandemics, but also in a certain sense before the Muslim invasions, you have to really to think how these Romano-Germanic kingdoms in the West really considered their relation with the empire. There's another prejudice is saying, oh yeah, the Western Empire fell, so yeah, it was all the barbarians ruling now, and the Byzantines were there and in the east, and they stayed there. No, this was not the mindset. The mindset was still that, in a way or in another, all these Romano-Germanic peoples stayed still into the Roman Empire. As I said before, it's not really a matter of saying that these Germans were obedient to Constantinople, because they weren't. They were powerful kingdoms that enacted their own autonomous policies, etc. But the Roman Empire was powerful enough still to launch a counter-offensive to reconquer the West, and they did it, by the way, as a proof. And generally speaking, this world was still gravitating around the Mediterranean. Let's be frank about this. The wealthiest areas of Europe at the time were in the Mediterranean. And that's what all these Germanic peoples wanted to put their hands on, because that meant to control a freaking lot of money. At the same time, they still had to deal with other Germanic populations that were not settled down. There was even a very intense debate, or a very intense conflict that sometimes could take, in fact, even certain political siding in the international chessboard, if we want to use this term, that equated to say, okay, I stick to the imperial, I stick to the Roman model, I stick to the German model. We were talking about the relations, of the Ostrogothic princesses that were married with this or that thing. For instance, we have seen Theodoric now. We were saying before, she sealed the alliance between the Ostrogoths and the Visigoths. Then Ostrogoth, I think, or Ostrogoth, I don't know, she was married to Sigismund of Burgundy. So why was this important for the Ostrogoths? Well, because Burgundy was this kind of a smaller, I don't know how to say that in English, a buffer state. I don't know if it is actually correct. A buffer state between the Franks and the Ostrogoths. So that was important to take. By the way, I made a video about the Burgundians, the islanders of the migration era. This is the title, in which I discuss a bit from their own perspective how this was really about. And the Burgundians, in this sense, were also pretty hybrid, in the sense that they weren't really fully. They were too weak for sticking to taking one side and putting themselves openly into opposition either to the Franks and to the Ostrogoths. They preferred the Ostrogoths, but the Franks were also close, so they didn't have to behave like they had to be careful about their own political choices, and that was another important marriage. Theodoric had also another daughter that was Amalasuntha, that unfortunately she had a very sad story. These Byzantine princesses were all a bit, these Ostrogothic princesses were all a bit unlucky in that they had all sad stories and it kind of reflect ultimately the fate of the Ostrogothic kingdom. Amalasuntha, famously, she was married to Theodoric, and she was essentially the heiress of the Ostrogothic kingdom. And she was imprisoned, and she was actually the casus. She appealed to. Allegedly, at least to Justinian, because she had been imprisoned by the opposed Ostrogothic faction into Italy, and that's what triggered the Byzantine intervention officially into Italy, and that sparked started the Greek Gothic War, at least some years afterwards, however. It was part of the Reconquest, as we were saying, was part of a bigger plan, actually. There was also Theodoric's niece, who was sent as spouse of the Thuringian king Ermanfrid. Her name was Amalaberga, and she was daughter of Amalfrida, who was the daughter of Theodomir, who was Theodoric's father. So that's the thing. So there were certain relations that were, as you understand, woven with these several powers into Romano-Germanic Europe that were aimed at countering the Franks in their push. So, what I had forgotten to say, and this is really the point that I was trying to make, is that Theodoric's sister had been sent as wife, as spouse to the Vandal king. as well, because Theodoric had actually, as we were saying before, had managed to recover Sicily from the Vandals and kind of establishing Ostrogothic power in the region, and he had sent his sister in this alliance with the Vandals, so he's opposed to the Vandal king, but with a guard of 5,000 troops. So it's not really a very happy evenience. The Vandal king was Trasamund, and this happened in 500 AD precisely. And by the way, another thing was the formal alliance with the Franks as well, by through the marriage of Audofleda, sister of Clovis I, with Theodoric himself. So the thing here was essentially setting up a net of relations with all the major Germanic powers around there and saying, okay, let's keep everything stable. Now, this would require a bit more of an analysis of the whole period to understand in every single case what this eventually brought to, because the story is more complicated than it sounds. But looking at, and we don't have time for this, but looking at the whole picture, however, we have to consider the broader meaning of this political action. So Theodoric basically was allying with the Burgundians, the Visigoths, the Vandals, and the Thuringians. So there was also this attempt of Pacific coexistence between the Franks and the Ostrogoths into Western Europe. And evidently this was, you can't be at war all the time. And being at war is a pretty serious thing. It was no actually direct clash at this point between the Ostrogoths or the Franks. I mean, there was a sort of lot of proxy war, definitely. A big deal of backing this or this other faction. So most of the actual clash, I'm sure, yes, the Franks and the Goths at this point clashed, especially with the Visigoths against the Franks. But this system was still holding overall, as in terms of repartition of spheres of influence and how it had to work on the broader scale. So the Franks were keeping to expand. So as you can see from the map, here you realize there was this Burgundian kingdom in the middle that kind of halted a bit the situation, because also in here the Franks managed to extend their own power, but it was still a mountainous area. There is the Massif Central in France in here. There is the Rhone Valley with lots of fortified cities. Then there are the Alps. So even when the Franks managed to intervene into Burgundian affairs and also partly triggering the Ostrogothic intervention, the Ostrogoths basically will seize part of southern France. The Franks would not be able to essentially extend their direct influence over the Burgundian kingdom or over the Burgundians proper, and they also use this as sort of buffer state on its own. So the further route of expansion of the Franks is against the Alamanni. I made a video also about the Alamanni, so if you're interested about that perspective. But the Alamanni are also pretty. They were enemy of the Franks. They had shared also. I won't repeat myself, but they fight. They put up a resistance, but they eventually the weaker side. So what Theodoric does was taking to contain the Franks by taking the Alamanni together, like with the Visigoths, under his own protection. This was very important to do because you realize that now Theodoric was intervening directly in the events of certain people, so we're also relatively far or not excessively controllable from Italy, but that still were gravitating around Italy. So the Alamanni, here from the map you can understand it quite clearly. When during the wars against the Franks, basically certain Alamanni began to flee when they get defeated, and they tried to seek refuge into the lands of Theodoric. This was also very important in terms of strict, allowance also of because these were still the Alamanni were broken by the Franks, but they were still sort of autonomous entities. At least the various clans that moved did that as still kind of autonomous, at least let's say political entities, and so they can't go in other people's lands. Theodoric, at this point, the Goths controlled these very wide areas, also along the upper Danube, as you can see. So the Alamanni do not really have many options where to go to. They can't go east because there are the Thuringians in there, and they're also relatively poor areas of Germany, and they prefer to go into the Danubian lands of the Ostrogoths. And they need a permission to do that, and Theodoric accepts. And this was very important because besides showing magnanimity and being, he was taking a political stand. He was basically helping the refugees that were fleeing the Alamanni invaded by the Franks. So it was saying to the Franks, look, that you're implicitly doing something wrong, and we help those you're fighting against. And the same was done with the Visigoths, that as we were saying before, had closer ties with the Ostrogoths, and at this time were being expelled by the Franks from Aquitaine. So the idea was becoming a point of reference for all those populations that were being harassed by the Franks, and therefore making a broader creating a sort of barrier between the Franks and the Ostrogoths that could also shield, in this sense, the same Ostrogothic kingdom. Because as we were saying before, the Franks were able to expand pretty far, but they couldn't really their power is not this enormously centralized one. So they once they conquered a people, they had necessarily to negotiate how the local government would have been in some sort of decentralized fashion, with the local aristocracies and all. So Theodoric, in these circumstances, does another thing, that is invading Provence. Now, Provence was this area relatively fluctuating at that point between the Burgundians, the Visigoths, so that there was no clear direct ruler at this point, especially when the Burgundians and the Visigoths had been so sensibly weakened by the Franks. So, as we were saying before, it also was Provence was a very Romanized, very wealthy and Romanized land, and it was a very important trade center. trade, the actually great part also Frankish economy revolved around keeping open the traffics with the Rhone Valley, because that was the connection between the Mediterranean and Francia. So Theodoric makes this action, invades Provence. And so this is a very brilliant move, strategically speaking, because it allowed, first of all, to control those traffics. So more money into for the Ostrogoths. Secondly, taking them away, in fact, from the Franks in part. Secondly, reinforcing also, locally speaking, the Burgundian and the Visigothic influence, since Theodoric was allied with them. So giving a bit of strength also to these powers that had been that were crumbling because of the Frankish expansionism, and to keeping open this bridge between Italy and Spain, because Provence at this point, as you can see from the map, borders with Septimania. It is this land of the would be today's France, Languedoc-Roussillon. There is this tribe of land that the Visigoths managed actually to maintain from the Franks, to maintain it to Gaul, and the Franks managed to seize Aquitaine, but not Septimania. This is due also to geographical reasons, because Aquitaine is a kind of a flat land. Aside from the Loire river, there is no major geographical obstacle between France and Aquitaine, so it could be seized as part of this very wide and fertile Atlantic plains in Western Europe. Septimania is a bit different because there are the mountains in the middle, and this area of Septimania was also, by the way, much more intensely Romanized than Aquitaine is. Sometimes when you this might happen to you when you read that Aquitaine was very intensely Romanized and it was difficult to control by the Franks because it always remained a kind of a different thing. This is partly true and partly false. First of all, we have to understand what we're talking about, because Aquitaine can be different things. Aquitaine, historically speaking, was this territory from the Atlantic side. So the plan here with the there is the Garonne, for instance, river. You can see it from the map. So where there is Bordeaux, etc. So that region, yeah, it's true. Aquitaine as a whole was a bit different, first of all, culturally speaking, from France. But sometimes the Aquitaine you hear about in late antique history is essentially comprehended. It's part of the Diocletian's repartition of that area of southwestern Gaul that had occurred at the end of the 3rd century and the beginning of the 4th. That encompasses partly also the Narbonensis Gaul. That would be roughly Septimania at this point. So actually Aquitaine and Septimania were pretty different places. Aquitaine was not so Romanized and so urbanized like Septimania was. So also in here, even in later medieval times, what you see is that where does, for instance, the county of Toulouse actually starts. Toulouse is, I don't remember, I think Toulouse is actually on the Atlantic watershed, but it's still part of that, say, Narbonensis area. That is also pretty mountainous in part and has certain characteristics. The Aquitaine kind of develops on its own because rather of the fragmentation of the Frankish domains rather than strictly, being a particular bulwark. Yeah, the Aquitanians kept rebelling also in not just in Merovingian but also in Carolingian times, etc. But it was still an area that could be relatively controlled. relatively, and it wasn't the same for the very south of France, this area of Septimania, that the Visigoths already at this time are able to maintain. So this tribe of land connected the Ostrogothic kingdom to the Visigothic kingdom. At this time, by the way, Theodoric manages to become Visigothic kingdom de facto, king de facto, because he the heir of the Visigoths had died. There was the heir of the kingdom who was still a minor, and basically Theodoric extends his patronage over Spain as well. So the Ostrogoths at this point control this very wide area of Italy, Spain, Burgundia, Vandal Africa. So a huge territory, and it prevents, most importantly, the Franks from reaching the Mediterranean. So today a series of interruptions. I'm sorry about that. And what I was trying to say is that the Franks were prevented by the Goths in this way to even enter the Mediterranean. This was very important, as we're saying, not just from a strictly economical point of view, so that the Franks couldn't basically control southern Gaul and its very wealthy area. It's very intense traffics, but also it couldn't intensify its relations with Constantinople. This is very important because eventually this would have been achieved by the Franks at the end of the Ostrogothic kingdom, and by this time the Franks were basically the major Byzantine allies in the West, exactly for the same reasons that opposed the Franks to the Goths, because the Goths at this point were a major power in the West that the Byzantines weren't looking favorably at all, as they had sent the Ostrogoths into Italy themselves, just to get rid of them from the Balkans, but indeed they realized that they wanted to act essentially to act a bit on their own, and they were a very mighty power at this point, so powerful in fact that what could represent an obstacle also to the control of the Mediterranean. Many people say, oh well, the Ostrogoths were weak, because look at how eventually the Greek Gothic War actually went. But this is not really true. This is not really true. Actually, if you look at how the same Ostrogothic War actually went, because as we were saying before, it could have been handled differently. The Byzantines could have wiped out Goths without further revival of Ostrogothic resistance, but still, it was a major operation and a very difficult one, also, let's say, a very demanding one in logistical terms, etc. There is a lot of debate also in here. Yeah, how did Justinian have to do this? I made videos about that. Just to tell you all, I think the Byzantines were doing good. Probably, yeah, but many people say, oh well, but they should have thought that everything could crumble from a moment to another. Well, no, because if the Justinian pandemics had not arrived, probably the Byzantines would have managed not only to reconquer Italy, Africa, and parts of southern Spain, but also to re-establish something stronger into the Mediterranean. And those were exactly the lands they had to reconquer in order to achieve that. If you look at what the Byzantines did, basically they recovered all the most Romanized lands of the empire. They were exactly the ones they reconquered, and that could still support the late antique civilization, practically, and that was the core of the Byzantine lands. The idea is that Theodoric, from his own side, knew that the Franks and the Byzantines were kind of operating in order to weaken the system that they had managed, that the Ostrogoths had managed to build, so also this the Ostrogothic system was rather weak, and it didn't. It wasn't weak. Today, I don't know if it's there or it's some Valentine's Day. I can't really think straight. But what I mean is hugely powerful, but it didn't have solid premises. And actually, the same Byzantine and the same Ostrogothic, the same Ostrogothic net of relations was can be interpreted as sort of a relatively desperate measure to try to counter these very powerful entities of the empire and of the Franks. So we have seen how Theodoric hosted those groups of Alamanni that were fleeing the Danube, especially into the regions of Raetia. The Raetia would be roughly today's Switzerland, and other bordering lands in the east with the Noricum. So in the Austrian western, say in the Alps. And this is important because also in here settling a people was not just wasn't devoid of strategical meaning in itself. It wasn't just a political slogan. Let's say, look Franks, I am hosting the guys you were fighting against. I'm hosting your enemies. But it also meant really to settle certain armed societies around certain usually natural bulwarks. It's a bit like what the Romans did with the Burgundians. They defeated them on the Middle Rhine, and they settled them into what would have become Burgundia proper, that is between the Jura Mountains and the Rhone Valley, etc. And especially in these mountainous lands, settling these peoples was very important, because with a relatively few demographic strength, they could control effectively the mountain passes. So the major logistical challenge at this point was actually crossing the Alps. These guys did them, but one thing was doing it with, bands of raiders that were more mobile and could pass unopposed. Say not unopposed, but without even without being controlled so easily. One other thing was to launch a big invasion throughout mountain passes that paradoxically has more. It necessarily requires an army at least to stand, but that proportionally has more weakness because of the attrition that can be ultimately exploited to counter it and to stop it. I realize today I'm talking about lots of things. I should really dedicate a single video for each one, because I was thinking now about how the borders between these Romano-Germanic kingdoms actually worked. That is extremely fascinating. But let's say that there weren't much of physical borders. It was much more about who was inhabiting. First of all, from across those mountains, and also how the mountains were guarded. Now we saw how the Alamanni were settled in this defensive fashion. But eventually the Franks would have crossed the Alps during the to Longobard times, especially, etc. Just for saying that it wasn't something difficult to do, really, in itself. But it was something difficult to do because of the conditions, the political and social conditions of what you found across the Alps. So that in this time, the Ostrogoths really, as you can see from the map, controlled a big deal of territories that were across the Alps and that it could hold. This means that they were strong, so they could actually claim sovereignty on those lands. But by the way, were not directly under their control. Here you see these colors, and you say, "Oh wow!" Now the Ostrogoths controlled, or the Franks, let's say, controlled all these wide areas. It wasn't really like that. I mean, it's not like a 19th century national state that has borders and all. These are more to be understood as dominations over certain communities that were living in there. They had a certain power themselves, and they were essentially swearing allegiance to the local, to these bigger rulers, also for the sake of protection. Because if you had always been, let's assume you were a tribe that was dwelling in here, I don't know, from a local Germanic clan, and you lived, I don't know, close to Vienna, you were pretty well off, because probably the major threats you had were guys coming, like here you see the Longobards that were looming over the situation, or the Gepidae, or but you're still decentralized in and you have these problems, let's assume. So you can call up Ravenna and say, look, Theodoric, I feel threatened by these guys. I swear allegiance to you, so that we are cool. You are nominally my patron in a certain way, and if something wrong happens, and obviously this implies that these guys would have given him some sort of tribute to prove essentially this submission. And in exchange, hopefully, the Ostrogoths would have intervened if you were in trouble. And there was no much other way to rule at this point. I mean, even if you look at the Byzantine Empire, you realize that especially in certain areas along the Danube, etc., it's not that it was a very direct control of the area. Think about when the Ostrogoths were in Mysia. Yeah, that was nominally a Roman land, but come on, there were the Ostrogoths there, so it's not that there were... I'm sure there were Roman officials going there and kind of helping the Ostrogoths and administrating, etc., but really what I would like to make you understand is that the strategic control over these areas mostly passed from the Terrans. And that it was enough to own, I don't know, a fortified city, like, I don't know, Verona, or, I don't know, here, what else we read, or Naissus, or Cologne, to exercise I don't think Cologne had walls, I don't remember. Yeah, probably still had it, I should check, but anyhow, to have a huge range of influence over, a consistent influence over a relatively wide range of territory. So it was more what you could do from these. Why was the Byzantine Empire standing? Because there was a structured administration everywhere? No, it was mostly standing because there was a city like Constantinople that controlled all the traffics passing between Europe and Asia and the Black Sea and the Aegean Sea, and it was very heavily fortified.
So if that had fallen, the Byzantine Empire would have melted down. Yeah, sure, there would have been some kind of administration there that would have kind of kept things in order, but it was still chiefly working city by city. So the direct control was wishful thinking most of the times in this context, and it was much more important to weave these relations between the various people, the various communities, let's say, and to give them something valuable in exchange for your demands. In the case of the Alamanni, that is pretty obvious because those were being crushed by the Franks, so Theodoric gave them new land to settle in, and that's why certain regions of the Alps, up to a very short time ago, still spoke in the valleys the so-called Alamannic language. Because those were the refugees that came from Swabia into the Alps at the time of Theodoric, for instance. And the same goes at this point the with Pannonia, so this area of, say, today's would be roughly today's Low Austria and Hungary and Western Hungary, and with Dalmatia. Dalmatia was also very important because it was also relatively Romanized. Dalmatia is mostly the coastal part that really made the money, because there were substantial cities on the Adriatic coast that made money. The hinterland is pretty wild, pretty mountainous, etc. But that was important as well, because through controlling the mountains there, you could also keep the Byzantines relatively at bay. It didn't serve much, also because Narses, for instance, invaded eventually. The Ostrogoths were invaded not just from the south, from Sicily, from the south of Italy, but also through Illyria at a point. So this is also important. Geographical bulwarks, etc., at this point are not functioning by themselves. So you have to control them. And at this point, the main problem was having people, like demic resources, manpower, to actually control those lands. It wasn't something. It was a luxury good having manpower at the time. You have to think of Europe to be slowly growing very depopulated, especially certain areas of Europe at this time were almost inhabited. The majority of the population was concentrated only in certain areas. If you take these Danubian lands, for instance, that the Ostrogoths were controlling, they were pretty much depopulated. And by the way, this happened also because they had not ever been extremely Romanized. The Danubian frontier was mostly a military frontier, where there was just Vindobona and Carnuntum and Aquincum, and that's it, basically, and there weren't other major cities in the area. Because they weren't very fertile areas. Mesia, for instance, had been historically a very fertile area, which was rare along the Danube, and that's probably part of the reason why the Ostrogoths had settled there, because they had found enough resources to leave. You have to think really of also winning over the environment at this time was a pretty expensive enterprise. You couldn't go anywhere and say, okay, now we settle with the people. You needed pastures, so you needed fertile land, and if the land was not good, we're talking about large areas that had to be able to support such settlements that to us maybe sound ridiculous, because we're talking about not more than 100,000 people altogether that were moving to that with these Germanic populations. But at the time, that was huge, was an enormous number, and even the land was not really organized in a fashion, was not really the technological potential to feed all these people in a relatively let's say in a not very fertile land. However, the Danubian frontier is important in here for essentially we essentially hinted at the role it had in shielding a bit the Ostrogothic kingdom, securing the eastern flank from the Roman Empire. So that the Goths had at least this buffer area that could work also in terms of could become a battleground against an eventual Byzantine invasion. Naturally, if the Goths had been able to mount that up. It was also important because there were lots of peoples that were gravitating on the left bank of the Danube, so from the side of the so-called Barbaricum, while the right one was the right bank was had been Roman, historically speaking. They were also pretty dangerous because these were sort of semi-nomadic populations. They were still unstable. They still were hungry for land, and the Ostrogoths had to keep them in check. They had to stem them, and they were able to keep them at bay because they were objectively a hell of a power. Like for instance, the Longobards that at this time were still in the Barbaricum. Those were not really a small people. They were making their way through through Central Europe, and they were acquiring consistent power. But still, they didn't dare intervene to invade the Ostrogothic kingdom. They waited before that. They waited that the Ostrogothic kingdom was destroyed, the Byzantines were weakened. Also in there, it's not that one day they woke up and decided to invade everything without it. Probably also in there was some negotiation with the Byzantines we're not really aware of historically. So it was a very delicate equilibrium that you must give at least Theodoric was able to maintain standing. So I said it was on weak premises because we'll see that especially Ostrogothic society was a bit undermined by the presence of the senatorial elite who still wanted to get rid of the Germans into Italy. But this trade relations kind of held for some time. Actually, at the same end of Theodoric reign, things started to go wrong because when Amalasuntha was married to the Visigoth king Eutharic, Eutharic died without pretty soon, so that no lasting dynastic connection was established effectively between the Ostrogoths and the Visigoths. In 522, the Catholic Burgundian king Sigismund killed Theodoric's grandson. It was his own son, by the way, Sergeric. And at this point, by the way, the Ostrogoths kind of retaliated by annexing part of the Burgundian lands somewhere around 523 AD. The rest of Burgundy at this point was really siding more with the Franks because they were worried actually now about this change in relation with the Goths. And also with the Vandals things kind of got bad because the Catholic Vandal king Hilderic imprisoned Amalafrida, that we were talking about before, and killed her Gothic guard. So even in there, Ostrogothic influence was kind of reduced sensibly, and Theodoric was, before dying in 526 AD, was actually planning an expedition to restore his power over the Vandal kingdom. So you see that already towards the end of Theodoric's reign, together with other internal problems, seemingly plots from the senators that wanted to kind of weaken the Goths, etc., this whole system was starting was beginning to crumble in a way or in another. And this was pretty serious because it corresponded definitely to a sort of, I can say, of a sudden collapse of the Ostrogothic authority. over the Western Mediterranean, but kind of showed that it was creaking. Okay, so it started happening in especially when these things happen all together, more or less in the same years. You realize there is something going on. That there is, even if someone who has sensed that there is some change, you have to think of also naturally of the Italian aristocracies to be pretty much involved in all these intrigues, and also that explains also in part all these alleged mysteries about how this whether it was true, I don't know, that there were plots against against Theodoric that eventually brought to the death of Saint Boetius, for instance, etc., and people wondering, you can't sense this from the political situation or the international situation. It was something that was crumbling. And also in here, history might have taken other paths, because let's assume, I don't know, that there had been an heir to the Visigothic kingdom coming straight from Theodoric's blood, or that I don't know, different arrangements in the Burgundian aristocracy equilibrium would have not led to this break between the Ostrogoths and the Burgundians, and this kind of coming close together of the other of the Burgundians and the Franks. Let's assume, I don't know, the Alamanni had won Tolbiac against the Franks. Everything would have changed radically. I don't know, maybe the Alamanni at that point would have become a problem from the same Ostrogoths of some kind. But really the whole political scenario would have slowly changed and taking other paths. But so it didn't happen. So what I mostly like to stress about this is there was a broader Ostrogothic coordination between the peoples that were inhabiting, let's say, the Germanic world. The Germanic peoples that were inhabiting the Germanic world and the Mediterranean, Central and Eastern Mediterranean area. So this was sort of containment policy most of the time, as we have seen, and there were diplomatic relations, parental relations, as we have seen, treatises of official reconnaissance as well, and that towards Constantinople. That also was quite important, because Constantinople at this time was still, I was saying before, was still kind of saying, okay, but you are there in the West as German peoples, but always remember that you are there on our behalf. This is also a very overlooked chapter, I believe. Rome was at this time, Constantinople, say better, was essentially still convinced that it could take those territories back, and these Germanic peoples knew that. They were actually pretty scared, because even think about the Ostrogothic Kingdom, it's pretty close to Greece, to the Eastern Mediterranean. So the Ostrogoths didn't have a powerful navy, for instance, at least not as much as the Byzantines. They could, as we have seen, mount up expeditions to go across the Mediterranean in Africa, and also supporting operations into the south of France, south of Gaul, etc. And they also had pretty good infrastructures. If you look at the think about all the ports that were present in Italy under Ostrogothic control, etc. Even though you realize, if you read the Gothic War of Procopius, is that the Ostrogoths, during the Byzantine invasion, attempted to use these means against the Byzantines, and they failed badly, both in maritime and siege warfare. This is perhaps also a bit stereotypical and overly exaggerated. I mean, surely the Ostrogoths weren't masters of the technology of the time, they still were pretty much Germanic in mindset and partly in knowledge. But it's also a bit stereotypical in my opinion, because the Ostrogoths were actively managing Italy from decades, from a generation, or even more, before the Byzantine invasion. So it's not so it's difficult to believe really that that we're so handicapped but at using, I don't know, siege equipment or ships, etc. Surely the Byzantines were better, but probably in there the Byzantine sources wanted also to stress, oh, look at these peoples, how barbaric they are. And actually, when the Ostrogoths resort to scorched earth strategy, the Byzantines get pretty much in trouble. They lose Italy once again, and a terrible war once again ensues. I mean, the Greek-Gothic War was really a mess. They really made 2 or 3 times back and forth from the north of to the south of Italy. It was really an immense destruction. So the important, however, is that these Romano-Germanic kingdoms still saw the Roman, let's say, model as a viable option of some sort. Not because they wanted to be Romans themselves, but because they realized that as long as Constantinople legitimized their rule wherever they were, they would have benefited from it in some way. The Ostrogoths had this cooperation with the Roman Senate, with the Roman Pope. They integrated the Romans they let the Romans administrating Italy while they were thinking about the army, essentially. As we have seen, were senators. There were Romans and Goths in Theodoric's council in Ravenna, etc. So Italy is probably the most representative example of this, like that the Goths couldn't really do without the Romans at this point. If you look at more faraway lands, you realize that this was true as well. For instance, Clovis got the vicariate of the Gauls from Constantinople, and a purple mantle, and this thing that essentially recognized his rule over those lands of Gaul. There had been some of the most important Roman lands of the empire, and they were still pretty much alive in Roman civilization. In the video about Clovis, I discussed pretty extensively how essentially Clovis made it because he understood he had to integrate immediately the very powerful Gallic, the very powerful Gallo-Roman aristocracies, especially the bishops, etc. So that also entailed a lot of important relations with the local society, and this was a great edge for the Franks, because the Goths were still reasoning in a sort of positive models compared to the Romans. For instance, they were Arians. Now we will discuss it later. Just wanted to finish by saying that the Visigoths as well were pretty much sensitive to the Roman models. At this time, actually, the Goths are more concerned about actually fighting into the Iberian Peninsula to strengthen their own monarchy. So expanding, trying to curb the Swabians. Here you see they are in the north of Portugal, northwestern Spain. The Iberian Peninsula here was not a unique block. There were many different communities also. The Iberian Peninsula was pretty diverse in its own territory. There were, let's say, also environmentally speaking, there are very different weathers and environments, etc., and terrains, etc. I mean, northern Iberia and southern Iberia were like two opposite worlds in many ways. The but So they weren't very concerned. It's mostly during the 6th century that the Visigothic monarchy tends to build itself, however, on the wake of the Roman rule. I mean, basically, the Visigothic court of Toledo was being shaped, and especially its ecumenical councils, in a fashion that resembled pretty much the imperial models of Constantinople. The Goths, if they had not been they were wiped out by the Arabs, they would have actually developed something very positive also relatively to the papal models in Italy. This idea that was one pope is something pretty late that develops into the 11th century. At the beginning, every bishop that was powerful enough to carry out such politics would have wanted to emerge as the leader of Christianity, and Spain with the Visigothic monarchy was pretty much pushing that, and also the Visigothic monarchy was assuming lots of models from the Byzantine court. And maybe I will discuss this topic another time. Another very important thing to read this international equilibrium is religion. I've been talking extensively about in my videos about how the Germans used sometimes Arianism to claim essentially a sort of different status from the Roman Catholics at this point, from a political point of view. So it wasn't much about actual beliefs, as always in history. It was because, by the way, most of these Germanic aristocracies, even when they were Arian, so formally Christian, they still openly believed, by the way, into the at least not openly, but they surely still believed in their own pagan traditions, and as elites they didn't show it off much, because being involved into this international business, especially being recognized by the Romans as sort of part of the cool Christian guys, but they didn't show it off. But the rest of the the Germanic population, the noun was being integrated into the local population. It was getting Christianized. But it wasn't really a religious point. It was a political point of view. So if you look at this map, you have this axis: Italy and Spain versus France and the Byzantine Empire. So what's the big difference here? Religion, because the Franks are Catholic just like the Byzantines. The Goths instead are Arian. What did this mean in practice? Well, it meant in practice that while the Franks were essentially accepting fully the cooperation with the Romans by saying, okay, we convert to Catholicism, we don't start persecution against the Catholics. Also in here, relatively to the Arian persecutions of the Catholics, a lot of has been said as if there were actual persecutions. Most of the times there really weren't. I mean, what we call by persecution in here was mostly like replacing a Catholic bishop with an Arian one. It almost never escalated into violence. At least we have no true evidence of that. Naturally, Catholic historiography was telling that, the Arians were kind of the bad guys, and always with double standards, by the way, because, for instance, the papal Rome and its historiography was had different standards for the Vandals and the Goths, that were both Arians, but they had different roles. Why, according to you? Well, simply because the Vandals had sacked Rome, and they were threatening the grain supplies to Italy, well, the Ostrogoths were kind of the pupils of the Romans, and they had been sent there to rule. And they were respectful towards Rome. They were respectful towards the Pope and the senatorial class. So also in here you see a bit of a. So that's why we for instance, we have this prejudice towards the Vandals, because yeah, they did certain nasty things back in the day, but it's not that they were that bad compared to actually everybody else out there, including the Romans. So the stereotype of the Vandals comes from this pro-Catholic propaganda that looked at the Vandals saying, okay, those were bad. And not even entirely because of that, but because we have seen that the Vandals had this peculiar strategical role that was oppositive to, more than to the Catholics, to Italy and the papacy and Ravenna. Okay, but what really the difference was is that why were essentially the Franks converting straight away to Catholicism and the Ostrogoths no? Were they more Romanized? No. We have seen the Franks were less Romanized than the Goths. The reason was very, very different. First of all, looking at the map, you realize the Franks were pretty far from the Byzantine Empire. So they didn't care much about what the Byzantines could do against them, because they knew that they had no way to... I mean, up to a certain point, at least those weren't their main concerns. The main concern of the Franks were the Goths now. So all these purple area you see in the map. So what's the best ally? The one who also has the same problem, because borders with the Goths and doesn't like them pretty much and fears their threat. The Byzantines. So what you do, naturally, also here it's not a fully international relation. It has to do also much with what how the Merovingian dynasty was being built, the relation with the local church, etc. The Franks prefer to claim straight away that they are Catholic. They are good friends of the Romans, that they oppose the Goths, who are Arians as well, and that have this evident evident pain in the behind for both the Merovingians and the Byzantines, and so they go with that. So why did the Goths didn't convert to Catholicism? Well, this is also not very easy to answer, and a strictly at least it's pretty easy to understand in some ways, but it's not easy to explain, because you have to think that there was definitely certain cultural resistance. As I was saying, these Goths were mostly pagan, originally speaking, and their Arianism was mostly saying, okay, we're still like that, just partially integrating this at a middle class level, we can say, of actually the mass of the peoples. So partly, however, this resistance was still there, but was progressively kind of melting away, because especially in Italy and in Spain, there were extremely densely populated areas. The Goths were being absorbed pretty rapidly. This was a big problem, and that's one of the part of this structural problems that eventually brought to the same collapse of the Ostrogothic net of alliance. As we were saying before, mostly was the Burgundians and the Vandals that now had converted to Catholicism. So even before the Goths, and this is interesting, that had instead been so intensely Romanized, and that were like pushing to that direction. So saying, now we are Catholic too. So they were taking a stand also, just like the Franks, towards a leap towards the Byzantines, and saying, okay, look, we convert to Catholicism, finally, we're not Arian anymore. Because they wanted to counter the Ostrogothic influence. It was so big and so powerful. It was a great problem for the Goths, because the Ostrogothic elites at this point had kind of bet everything on the Arian thing. They had bet the whole relation, the whole relation with these aristocracies. They had kind of the key point here also in controlling these areas was the cities, and the cities were ruled by the bishops. So as long as there was a strong military presence of pagans or Arians at least, still these bishops could be kept at bay. When progressively the Gothic population blended in with there was no one who could fully support at this point this continuing being Arian in lands that were so intensely Catholic. And there was no one to oppose, for instance, the push of these bishops anymore. Bishops were also very, very influent people, very powerful people that could really even make a city revolt. Think of all these big cities of the in Italy, like Ravenna, like Rome, like Milan, like Verona, like Pavia, etc. So all very the word they made up the chain, the infrastructure to control the whole peninsula, and that had to be controlled necessarily also by faithful communities. So the Goths at this point are kind of a bit in trouble, because this has been a kind of a weakening factor for all the Arian kingdoms. That there has been a moment into which even the aristocracy begins to get split between the Catholics and the Arians, and this has nothing to do with actual persecution. This is what most people don't understand. This happened also in Lombard Italy, for instance, when you see the Catholic and Arian party in the nobility. You don't have to think that these guys were kind of harassing the local clergy by saying, no, you have to be Catholic, no, you have to be Arian. They didn't give a damn about that. Most of the times they cared just about keeping them fine. So even if they were, if you were Catholic and these guys were Arians or vice versa, it was actually usually vice versa, you let them stay. It was like a political party, it was like connected to, in fact, these international relations. Do you want to be pro-Rome or against Rome? This was really the point. And it was not an easy question to answer, especially for certain Germanic peoples, like the Ostrogoths, that had everything to lose to actually see the Roman influence reinforced in their own lands, because they were the Romans were just next doors, and they could have easily re-annexed the kingdom. So that's why the Goths didn't do it. And plus, there was another important reason, is that we said it a bit before, those Germanic populations that were still living into Central Europe, outside of the sedentary world, were still on the move, and that were very superficially Romanized. Certain were Arian already, certain were not even Christian at this point. If you take the Longobards at this time, kind of getting Arianized a little bit, but very superficially. By the way, seemingly the Longobards got Christianized by the Goths. That's partly also the reason why they were Arian. The Thuringians were almost, and the Alamanni as well, they weren't even Christian de facto. Yes, some noble was, but just by pure formality sometimes, if they had to get married with people that were already Christian around the world. For instance, Clovis, we recalled it the other time, he was son of a Frankish king, Chilperic, and his mother was Thuringian. And you have to imagine in this that obviously Clovis was the first one Christianized among the Franks at this point, at least to make the Franks officially Christian. But you have to think that part of these populations actually came from, of these dynasties came from peoples that were still fully pagan in many ways. I mean, Clovis' mother was definitely surely a supporter of the non-Roman party, non-Romanizing party, while Clovis' father had served the Romans for a long time, that fought for them. He understood the advantages he could get, that he could have got from cooperating with them into Gaul, that was so intensely Romanized. So at this point, from a strategical point of view, it was important for the Ostrogoths to win partly also the favor of those populations like the Alamanni and the Thuringians that were pressed by the Franks. That was a pretty good... the Alamanni and the Thuringians both, and eventually were practically curbed by the Franks. The Thuringians were wiped out by the Franks and the Saxons combined. Kind of interesting, because the Saxons were all but Christian at this point, so this tells you also how it was all a political game in a religion, and had very few to do with that. And as the Franks were Catholic, the Saxons were pagan still. So interests make strange bad companions. And so in front of peoples like the Alamanni and the Thuringians were still fully Germanic, and they had in their mindset that they had not entered into the idea that they were framed into the Roman Empire. The Goths had done it, so they kind of remained still Arian to say, okay, we entered the Roman Empire in a certain sense, but we are still independent in from our point of view, so that we keep Arianism as our slogan. The Franks had fully entered into that. The Thuringians and the Alamanni really not. Yeah, the Alamanni had been Roman federati, but they developed a kind of an anti-Roman identity, and you can't clearly see that. I mean, there were times into which, especially when they wanted to be settled into the Agri Decumates, they got the okay from Rome, paying with their federatio. So with their fedus, so their idea of getting formally allies by the Romans. But the Alamanni were completely different in mindset, say, from the Franks. At least, initially they were pretty similar. Actually, they were both West Germans, but while the Franks stuck with Rome, the Alamanni went in the opposite direction. Also partly because they were bordering, so they had contrasting interests, but also there are kind of other reasons, chiefly the fact that the Franks settled into areas that were already Romanized, and intensely Romanized, and the Alamanni not so much. At least they remained in parts that were still largely also pagan, or that they contributed with their migration to re-paganize in part. So if the Ostrogoths needed the help of the Thuringians and the Alamanni, they still had to show that they weren't fully Romanized. They were still Arians. So they had this religious orientation that entailed still a sort of an oppositive, or at least an alternative model to the Roman one. This is important because under these, behind the appearances, all these Germanic populations didn't really want to be under the Roman Empire. They wanted to build simply kingdoms on their own. And claiming to be more or less Romanized was just a matter of political convenience, as we've seen. Certain, as we've seen, were obliged to do that, but those who lived in the center of Germany, like the Alamanni and Thuringians, couldn't care less about the Romans. At least by that moment, because they were actually in Germany, so Constantinople didn't arrive. They were surrounded by peoples that instead were framed into this Roman orbit, but they were still essentially Germanic kingdoms. So, and they hated their Goths because, as we've seen, the Thuringians and the Alamanni were being invaded by the Franks, who were these champions of Catholicism and of Romanism, we can say. whereas those were kind of the champions instead of Germanism. So the Goths needed to play sneakily and to win the favor of these guys. So religion was also so important to determine this. The religious siding was crucial to this balance, and it would have kept being so. Eventually, these problems were pretty much alive at the time, because the migration era was not still over. There were still lots of people who had to be Christianized. These Romanian Germanic kingdoms still had not fully regulated the relations between the Catholics and the Arians, so still a lot of integration had to take place. These problems kind of finish much later, when especially when the Byzantine Empire stops. I can't say really that. Where the Byzantine Empire kind of stops being so influential in the West. So from the Arab conquests, but even before in a certain sense, because it mostly corresponded at a point to a natural process of Catholicization of the Romano-Germanic kingdoms, like it happened for the Ostrogoths, like it happened for the Visigoths, it would have happened for the Visigoths, etc. Because when in fact the Goths were wiped out, now we'll see it, which were the major powers in there? The Franks and the Byzantines were both Catholic. So the Goths in Spain kind of adapted. Also because now it was a long time that the Goths were in Spain, so now the world population had kind of mixed with the locals. Just the Longobards arrived out of nowhere, without minding about anything. They didn't want to be Catholic, they didn't want to be Roman in the first place. No, actually also the Longobards got Catholic pretty easily, because it would have been stupid, while put into this pinch between the Franks and the Byzantines, into a country like Italy that was fully Catholic, not to convert to Catholicism. It would have added to further weakness. And in fact, the whole story that the Longobards were so terrible against the Catholics and persecuted them is a pure myth. There is no single evidence of this, of persecutions of Catholics into the Longobards kingdom at all. There were these sides, these parties between the nobility that clashed against each other, and that's it, for strictly determining who had to rise to the throne point. What I'm trying to say is that the Ostrogothic kingdom kind of worked as a stabilizing force of those Germanized barbaric populations that were entering into the harbor of this broader Hellenistic or Roman civilization. So the Ostrogoths acted a bit like a medium in this process, by still offering a model that is almost, say, kind of still very barbaric populations could still understand, in spite of being so different from theirs, and also in part. So this naturally placed itself as an alternative to the Romanization. So that, considering even this from the Byzantine point of view, you see this Ostrogothic kingdom that starts dealing also with other peoples that you might have interest towards, too, and increases, by the way, their own power, and decreases yours indirectly. So it's something you can't stand. In a country like Italy that is so intensely Romanized, where the local aristocracies are pushing for making you invade, for taking those lands back and taking their properties. Also think about the trade circuits in here were extremely important. Like Italy and Greece at this point were pretty interconnected. Also they were the most vital areas in the Mediterranean. So even reincorporating Italy was a big priority of the Byzantines. So you can't really blame Justinian for having done that. Yeah, okay, sure. Italy would have been better off without the Byzantine reconquest, but take it from the Byzantine perspective. It was important. Then also you have to reason in the mindset of a 6th century Roman emperor. You have to reconquer Rome. That's also another very, very important thing. So and this system was also bulwark towards the Frankish expansionism. It was warring so much all those populations that didn't want this major rising power now to swallow everything there in the west. So the Ostrogoths played it in a intelligent way. And even if this whole system was weak, it still, it had premises that couldn't last for very long. It still was very instrumental to shape eventually the balance that remained. You can argue for the whole Middle Ages. Now we'll see how. So I think there is no need to repeat now how the Goths finished. Simply Theodoric died. There was a major increasing problems with the local, with the international scenario, internal problems with the senatorial elite, which was Catholic, and there were also Theodoric's successors weren't really great rulers. At least I don't want to talk bad about them, because sometimes relatively to the monarchs of this era we get a sort of a caricatural description that sometimes is very misleading. We really don't know the quality of these kings, but we can understand that they didn't last for long. They weren't these extremely authoritative forces. They had even in the initial phase, thinking about vitiges, say that during the first phase of the Greek Gothic War, there were lots of problems that actually stemmed from not understanding how the next step had to be. From an Ostrogothic perspective, the main problem is that is having these Roman apparatus still alive within their own kingdom. And during the Greek Gothic War, the Ostrogoths finally understood with Totila that this model had to be reversed, that the Goths had to get rid of this thing. And since they were in war times, they had the means to wipe out the senatorial elite that now was siding openly with the Byzantines and that had called them in Italy. So trying to transform the Italic society into something else, into something more Germanic. So by making all the peasants, all the commoners, let's say commoners is maybe all the colons, and even the slaves, and freeing the slaves, this was a great important thing. It was very important for the future of Italy from a social point of view, because part of that individual, say, per capita wealth that would characterize, that actually was already characterizing Italy during the Middle Ages, actually stemmed from these changes. If Italy had remained with a senatorial elite that did what they wanted, its economical or technological potential would have remained kind of more crystallized, like a bit how would have happened into the Byzantine society in later times. Italy had perhaps already different premises from Greece and Constantinople, but from a social point of view, the Greek Gothic War, as disastrous as it was, it still set something that had huge influences for the history of mankind, because eventually what was set at this time especially with the Longobards, is something that would have had huge influences for the development of Italian society in the fashion it would have done towards the lower Middle Ages, and eventually with the Renaissance, etc. And it's interesting to compare also other models, like the Frankish one that I talked so often about, and instead was radically different, but also had very interesting fruits under this point of view. So, skipping, let's say, the Greek Gothic War that more or less I've been discussing in a nutshell. What I think it's very important is also to realize how the Frankish-Byzantine axis kept working later. You can argue that, in fact, the Frankish-Byzantine enmity, that is something you find fully expressed only at the time of Charlemagne, something that could have occurred much earlier, to prove that it's not that the Franks were pro-Roman because they were so keen about the Byzantines. As a matter of fact, they were even less Romanized than they were less Romanized than the Goths themselves. The Franks were much more Germanic at this point, also in traditions that is still stuck to that model because it was convenient for them, especially in their political elites. And also in here there would be so much to talk about, and how the Merovingians achieved that in goal, etc. But let's say that another factor that kept alive the Frankish-Byzantine axis was, at the end of the Gothic War, the Longobards invasion. So the Longobards invasion had a kind of devastating effect in the political equilibrium of Europe and the Mediterranean. Why? Well, because essentially it happened after the plague. So when Europe was heading towards this irreversible decline, into which the late antique culture basically transformed itself into the early medieval one, if you want, to say that in a very approximate way. So that when the Longobards were, now I should talk about Longobards, but let's make it simple. When they entered into Italy, they were pretty weak. I mean, they were actually probably one of the biggest peoples that had got into Italy. They were also pretty warlike, but they were divided. They didn't have a central monarchy. They were split in all these dukes that did everything they wanted. If they had been more centralized, with sheer numbers, that they could have kicked out the Byzantines out of Italy in a few years, but they didn't. So Italy became this kind of leopard skin, if you look at the political, because the Longobards settled here and there without any particular order. They managed to enucleate this main core of power in the Po Valley, but the rest of Italy was all basically split between them and the Byzantines, initially at least. So there was a main problem, because if this had happened like 30 years before, the Byzantines alone would have wiped out the Longobards. Now, instead, there were no resources anymore, because Italy was kind of it was about the whole system. It was the whole Mediterranean and European system that had contracted. One of the reasons why the Longobards invaded Italy so easily is that no Byzantine mobile army was present into Italy at that moment. Reason for which we also suspect that, contrarily wise to the usual Vulgata, the Longobards actually entered into Italy on the Byzantines' behalf as well, and then seemingly things got out of control. But this is a plausible historical option, actually, that might have happened like that. So at this point, what do the Byzantines do? They're exhausted. They have the Byzantine Empire has overly exhausted its resources to reconquest of the West. Now the plague struck, and plus the Longobards reign on it. So from the Byzantine perspective, it was a mess. They need the Franks. And actually, this is interesting, because at the very end of the Great Greek Gothic War, Italy was destroyed, and the Franks and Byzantines also were partly exhausted, and the Franks and the Alamanni launched a very deep raid into Italy, up to southern Italy actually, so going all the way down, and clash against the Byzantines. And also they get defeated by the Byzantines, by the way, and they. So at this point you realize, this was before the Longobards arrived, so this interludium between the Greek Gothic War and the very end of the Greek Gothic War. So you already realize if the Longobards had not arrived, the Franks would have immediately tried to seize Italy, because historically speaking that's what France at every time has tried to do, in a way or in another, in the continent. At this point the Longobards arrived, so the Franks and the Byzantines, instead of clashing together in kind of preceding what would have happened eventually between the Holy Roman Empire and the Byzantine Empire, they allied themselves once again. So this actually kept strengthening the relations between the Merovingians and Constantinople. So Clovis was dead by this time. They were his successors, and this paradoxically also partly strengthened further the Merovingian authority into France, because it might have happened as well that if these opportunities had not arisen, the Byzantines from Italy might have kind of weakened even Merovingian rule into Francia, which was feasible, especially kind of exploiting the rivalries that existed within the same Merovingian dynasty at this point. All the various brothers between which the empire was split at every generation. So, just for telling you how even certain dynamics kind of can be altered easily, if the Merovingian Empire naturally weakened by itself. By the end of the 7th century, you read Frankish Kingdom, but there wasn't anything like that. It was like 4 split kingdoms. Even the Longobards were more powerful than the Franks at that time. But it would have been even worse if probably the Byzantines had remained in Italy. And we don't know actually how the whole thing would have been dealt with, because the Byzantines would have continuously backed like the Visigoths and the Burgundians. They would have or the Alamanni or the Thuringians. They would have kept doing what the Ostrogoths had been doing before. So you see how geography also influences such things. I don't believe in geopolitics, but certain things at this time were definitely also influenced by geography. So it's kind of like the Franks got lucky in some measure by doing, at least, let's say better, the Merovingians got lucky as a dynasty because of that, partly. So the Franks got lucky also in another way in the 7th century, when the Arab invasions started. You will say how? The Franks eventually fought against the Arabs, so they were their enemies. Yeah, okay, sure. But at a broader level, we have to be a bit more Machiavellic, as when the Arabs conquer, Syria, Palestine, Egypt, etc., and they crush also the Visigothic Kingdom, by the way, which is not a few. The Roman Empire shrank, right? The Byzantine Empire lost like half of its territories, even more, extensionally speaking. So, who won big times there in the West? The Franks, obviously, because the Byzantine influence at that point was basically wiped out, because with the Arab invasions it was now impossible for the Byzantines to do what Justinian had done. to even think to go venturing once again in the west. They kind of decentralized everything. They said to every kind of, like in Italy as well. So in Italy they kind of said, okay, now you're there on your own, dear local administrators, do what you want. And that was a phase into which in fact Byzantine Italy in part got Longobardized, in part kind of Italianized, and how also in there for the following policies of the Byzantines into Italy, you realize that towards the High Middle Ages, in Italy, people were not that happy to act with the Byzantines anymore, like they had been previously, because a very different mindset and interests and even identity had kicked in. So the Franks were basically the unopposed power in there. Yeah, there were the Longobards that, as we've seen, they also made their own stand. Never underestimate the Longobards, because they were actually a solid kingdom after the first phase, contrarily-wise to all these stupid prejudices that exist over the Longobards. Open up a history book, please, if you have prejudices about the Longobards. And but it was definitely the Franks that eventually would have grown to be the hegemonic power. Already in the 6th century we have seen how they had managed to expand their power over the Thuringians, the Alamanni. And another very interesting point about this is that if you look at this map, now this is at the death of Theodoric. As we were saying before, the Ostrogoths had this power over the Danubian areas, let's say the high Danube, part of the middle Danube area. That area, when the Ostrogoth kingdom collapsed, was actually filled by the Franks. You see here it's written the Bavarians. Well, the Bavarians were kind of a relatively they weren't really a people as we think of them. Like the Alamanni were a people, the Thuringians were a people, the Longobards were a people. The Bavarians were something very we don't even know very much about their ethnogenesis. They were actually a collection of peoples. We're talking about Romanized populations, Celticized populations, Germanized populations that kind of stuck together in this duchy that was more like a Frankish emanation than a real ethnic people. Actually, yeah, I know today's Bavarians are something different. Naturally, there is a Bavarian identity and so on. But at this time, it was all still pretty fluid. And what is important is that the Franks basically managed to expand their after the collapse of the Goths, their power all over this Danubian area. This also remains pretty weak, however, and remains a sort of frontier area. That also remained a sort of playground between, in fact, between the Longobards and the Franks, as the Bavarians preferred to stick with the Longobards even though they fought against them, because the Longobards at a certain point kind of expand towards the north, towards the, say, the Danube watershed of the Alps, and they managed to secure that area and to win, basically, in fact, on the other watershed. But that is an area that eventually would grow to be very influenced also by, in Carolingian times, by the Franks, etc. So that part was also in the eastern part were the Longobards and eventually the Avars that kind of closed that area in practice. But what is important, after the collapse of the Ostrogothic Kingdom, the Franks now have influence over Thuringia, Alamannia, the Danubian area. They incorporate Burgundy. They manage finally to extend their control, say, over Provence, that had been both Visigothic and Ostrogothic, as we have seen, and they start interacting with the Longobards that actually remain the only independent power in Europe, in continental Europe. aside, well, okay, yeah, aside the Visigoths and the Saxons, etc. But generally speaking, this especially post-Arab invasion situation, the Longobards are the only people in there into Western Europe that kind of remain out of the control of the Franks, in part. And the Franks are kind of weaving certain relations with the Longobards by, however, they were rather ambiguous. Franks and Longobards have not really been very hostile to each other for most of their history. This is also another prejudice. In fact, as I always say, the Franks highly estimated the Longobards because they saw in them one of those true hardcore Germanic peoples that whose model had been a bit renegated by the Franks throughout their Romanization. The Longobards never Romanized officially. They never said, okay, now we are part of the empire, we get a legitimation from Constantinople. They didn't give it a freaking damn. And the Franks really admired them. And in fact, there was also in here talking about matrimonial relations. There was also a big deal of marriages between the Longobards and the Franks to keep a bit also this pretty ambiguous relation alive. So the Franks, as we were saying now, they were kind of splitting at least, so the Longobards had a kind of an easy life, but even the Longobards somehow recognized that the Franks were stronger. And in fact, one of the greatest indicators of this is looking at their borders, because there is something that also remains today between France and Italy. That is basically that the border is not placed on the between France and Italy is not based on the watershed of the mountains, but it's shifted towards Italy, because this started from from those very times in the 6th century when the Franks were stronger, and therefore they controlled the passes, and the Longobard kingdom kind of stopped at the entrance of those valleys, because they were the weaker side. But so in spite of that, also those frontiers, as we said, were pretty arbitrary by some measure. They weren't really controlled, and especially this side of the northwestern Alps between Gaul and Italy kind of remained a buffer area, and because the Franks were the core of Frankish domains was in the north of France, and the core of the Longobard domains was in the north of Italy. So what was in the middle, like in southeastern France and southwestern Germany, was kind of, it was a kind of a blurred thing. And it's just when eventually the Carolingians conquer the Po Valley and the Longobard Kingdom that obviously that changes once again, but up to a certain point, because the essentials were already set through this area. So this is an incredibly long video because I love this topic, as you've probably understood, and I would love to tell much more about this, but I think it's such a overly overlooked phase of history. Sometimes we get about these Romano-Germanic kingdoms as, kind of idling, passive powers that did nothing. Actually, they were extremely dynamic. And today, perhaps the first part of the video was a bit messed up. I don't know. Now I will have to edit it in some presentable fashion. But I hope I got the essential. We talk a bit. We actually went across the video is long because we went across a very long time. We started a bit from the 5th century, ending up to the 9th almost. So it's not easy to, but we focused to the 6th mostly, and these relations were very, very important. they are crucial to understand how Europe eventually developed, because they entailed also the movement of lots of masses of people that eventually came to determine the identity, the local identities of such regions. Think about these Alamanni refugees that were settled by the Ostrogoths in the Eurasian Alps. Think about the Longobards settling into that area of Italy. Think about how, you know, how the world system kind of could have changed in some way. With the Longobard invasion of Italy, we arrive essentially at the end of the migration era properly meant. Maybe you can extend it up to the Arab invasions a bit, if you consider the Slavs or also other peoples that came. But let's say, talking about the Latin Germanic West strictly, the Longobards were we're in the end of in the second half of the 6th century, so we're relatively late in time. So it's a period that was really long. I mean, the migration era lasted long, and it could have developed could have had different outcomes that today we tried to look a bit at, because they're very, very important. So I'm stopping now, and I hope that you enjoyed this video, and if you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you are interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time, and see you next time. Bye.